Thanks for having me. So I'm going to start with a brief talk and then move on to a live demo, and then we're going to wrap up with a talk as well. And I'll be watching the chat window as I go, particularly while I'm doing the live demo. So if you have questions, feel free to post them there. If it's relevant to exactly what I'm showing, I'm happy to sort of change gears and answer. Or if it seems like it'll be better answered, sort of discussed at the end, we might just hold off to it until then. So let me go ahead and share my screen and make this meeting controls. Okay. All right. So I want to talk about a world of possibilities today for reproducible publishing. So let's start by sort of defining what Quarto is. Quarto is a new open source scientific and technical publishing system. And the goal of Quarto is to make the process of creating and collaborating dramatically better. You can see in this schematic, we're basically starting with some documents that may or may not have code in it, but my guess is you are here listening to this talk because you are interested in documents that do have code in them. And as you can see, the code could be in any language. So I tend to write code in R, so the live demo is going to feature R, but you can really sort of swap any of those code chunks that I will be showing you with any of the other computing languages as well. And then this document gets processed by the Quarto engine, and the output could be anything as well. Word, HTML, PDF are ones that are probably very commonly used, but there's a lot more to it than just these as too. So Quarto unifies and extends the R Markdown ecosystem. If you are someone who's coming into this from that ecosystem and thinking, so where does Quarto differ? Let's talk a little bit about that. What I mean by unifies is that it unifies for people who love R Markdown. So if you are an R Markdown user and you've used it to create things like a book, a website, a blog, or maybe something like a journal article, you've probably used a different R package for each and every one of these. With Quarto, you only use the one command line interface, as opposed to the functionality being spread across these packages. It's unified in this one command line interface. And Quarto extends the R Markdown ecosystem for people who don't know it. So these are probably folks who do write computational documents, but perhaps not with R. And yes, you can run Python in a R Markdown document with the use of another R package like Reticulate, but I don't think that is like the most common use case. Most R Markdown users tend to be R users, and all of that beautiful functionality that's spread across many, many R packages are sort of not available to them because their computing isn't done in R. With Quarto, the idea is to sort of bring over a decade of knowledge and information and user experience together and make all of that available in one command line interface. So what are some ways that Quarto unifies and extends R Markdown? For example, consistent implementation of attractive and handy features across outputs, like tab sets or code folding or syntax highlighting. These are all things you can do with R Markdown, except in different packages. So for example, tab sets are easy to do in, say, slide decks, but not as easy to do perhaps in sort of single documents. And similarly, things like code folding and syntax highlighting are just examples of things that don't tend to work exactly the same way across different packages. In addition to that, Quarto has more accessible defaults as well as better support for accessibility, and we're going to give some examples of these during the live coding session as well. And it also has guardrails that are particularly helpful for new learners. If you've used either R Markdown before, chances are you have gotten stuck with a YAML error where it was cryptic enough that it wasn't clear to you whether it was a error that's happening because of something wrong with the YAML of your document, so that's the metadata on top, or something wrong with the actual code that you're running, like the R code chunks. So things like YAML completion and informative syntax errors tend to be quite helpful. And finally, as we said, it has support for other languages like Python, Julia, Observable, and more via the Jupyter engine for executable code chunks. So let's start with the demo. I am going to, oh, actually that link is incorrect. So let me go ahead and share the correct link with you. How do I do this? Get rid of my, give me 1 second. I am going to step out of this for 1 second and share the link with you. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, and I am going to put that link in the chat as well, and then I am going to go back to sharing my screen. So we are going to get started at this link. This is only if you would like to go hands-on and follow along with me. And then once I finish the live demo, I'll push my changes to this repository as well. So if you prefer to sort of see the baked cake, you can, get to it at the end as well. So let's go ahead and share one more time here. And what I am going to do is to open my RStudio window. And you can see that I have a document here in RStudio called just index.qmd. And whether you've seen Quarto before, or if you've seen R Markdown before, or if you've seen any computational documents before, this might feel familiar. If all of that is new to you, some of the look will still feel familiar. This basically looks like a Google Doc, something where I can say things like, I want to bold this text, or maybe something like I want to use code text for this text. So I'm using the visual editor that for the text portion of my document acts just like what you see is what you get visual editor that you might use to edit any other documents. But in here are two special things. On top of my document, I have what I call my YAML, which has some metadata about my document, like its title, which format I want to render to. And in this case, specific to RStudio, it's saying that I want to use the visual editor. And also in these sort of gray areas, I have code chunks. So executable code chunks in which I have some R code, basically. Let's go ahead and start by rendering the document. And if you're doing so using RStudio, generally I like using the option to preview my document in the viewer pane so that I can see my document on one hand of my screen and my output on the other hand of my screen. So let's go ahead and hit render. All right, so my title has been formatted a particular way where I can see that it's distinguished from the rest of my section headings. What my document outline shows here, I can also see sort of easily represented in my section headings in my document. So let's go ahead and do a few things. Let's go ahead and first of all, touch the text as opposed to the code. Let's do a little bit with the text. For example, here it says for this analysis, I'm using a data set from the lovely Palmer Penguins package. And I have here the Palmer Penguins package website, I think. So the URL to the Palmer Penguins package is here. And suppose that I want to insert this URL. I can go ahead and do that by simply copying the URL and inserting it using the visual editor. And if I render the document now, we'll be able to see that this becomes a clickable link in the rendered document as well. There's nothing super sort of exciting about being able to add a hyperlink to a document. This is something we can do in just about anything. But what is nice and special about the visual editor and how it works here is that if I convert to the source editor now, you'll see that actually under the hood, the markdown text for this is being written. So I don't have to write the markdown text. So if you're like me and you can never remember exactly how to get markdown correct for something like inserting an image, this is pretty handy. You can use the tools that are available in the visual editor to do so, but under the hood, RStudio is writing the markdown for you, which means that when you make changes to your document, if your document is, for example, version controlled, it becomes very easy to sort of do view the diff something that you wouldn't be able to do, which with either something like a rich text document or not as neatly with something like a Jupyter Notebook. So we talked a little bit about, visual mode is using Pandoc to render the text. For the code chunks, it's going through knitr first, which writes the markdown, and then Pandoc to get to the HTML output. So, but for the code chunks, both of them are in play. Now let's talk a little bit about the code chunks. For example, I have here a code chunk that actually loads a bunch of packages. Something I might want to do is I might want to do something like, say I want to turn off how this code chunk is presented on my document. I don't want to see that. So I use the echo option. And if I just then hit tab, I am able to see that I can choose between the options easily. And if I was to render this document, I'll be able to see that that code chunk is not sort of printed for me anymore in my output. If you're preparing a document for an audience that doesn't want to see any of your code, only wants to see your output, let's go ahead and refresh this. I think it didn't entirely finish rendering. Sorry, I did echo true. That's why that's not working. Here we go. If we were to say echo false, it's going to hide the code chunk from being printed. But what if I want to do it for my entire document? I can, of course, meticulously go through and add this code chunk option to everything. But instead, I can also go to the YAML of my document on top and say that I want to add an execute option where I want to turn echo to false. So I'm doing all of this using the YAML completion. And then I can see that all of my code chunks, the code chunks themselves are going to be hidden. Only the output or anything like warnings are visible right now. And if I really wanted to turn all of the warnings as well, a little bit of risky behavior, but I could do that up on the YAML as well. And the neat thing about this is that up here, I am adding some execution options for my code chunks, and the same options work across languages. So even though if you are a knitr user or an R Markdown user, these sound very familiar, you will see that if you have, if you're using the Jupyter engine and writing Python code chunks, you'll be able to use the exact same code chunk options as well. And the code chunk options that we add to our individual code chunks use this YAML style, which is very neat. So let's go ahead and do one more thing. Let's go ahead and make a mistake. So what I'm going to say is I want to not include this code chunk, but I have written it in a way that would make sense in sort of the old knitr and R Markdown context, but not using the correct YAML style chunk options for Quarto documents. I can see that I get an error as expected, but the nice thing is that the error is pretty informative and tells me exactly where the issue might be. And between that sort of error that points me to the right place and the YAML completion, it becomes a lot more straightforward to sort of get these right and teach yourself along the way what the appropriate syntax for the chunk options are. Now let's go ahead and move on to our code chunk that has a figure in it. So I am going to let's run this figure, and I want to open it up in my plot window here for a second, just so I can see what it is. This is an HTML output that I might want to post on the web, right? And if I am going to do that, something that would be good practice to do is to add alternative text to this. So I mentioned that not only Quarto has nice accessibility defaults, but it also provides good options for making your documents more accessible. So I am going to add a code chunk option called fig_alt, and I'm going to write some alternative text for this. So I might say something like a scatter plot of fill depth in millimeters versus fill length in millimeters of 3 species of penguins. And I probably would want to say what these species are in the alternative text. Showing a positive association. Maybe let's leave it there for now. I don't think it's the best description that I can write, but it is a short description for sort of demonstrative purposes that basically tells me what is happening in the plot. So I have a pretty lengthy code chunk option here. So something that I might do in order for my formatting to be a little bit better is to say, I want to start on the next line. And I might want to sort of indent things nicely so that it becomes a lot easier when I'm editing my document to be able to read this alternative text. And let's go ahead and render this for a second to see what it looks like on the output. All right. That text is nowhere to be found in my output. And that's exactly what I would expect, because that is alternative text that's meant to be accessible to a screen reader, but not to the human eye. But if I was to pop this out to a browser window, and I am going to right click on it and say that I want to inspect the element, so that I can go to the source code, I can see that this image has been inserted into the HTML code, and the alternative text that I wrote as a code chunk option is now available to a screen reader where this document might be published. So we've talked about sort of editing text, editing code chunks. Something else that tends to be pretty helpful in the context of at least my life is I do a lot of teaching. So what if you are actually teaching Quarto, like I am doing here? I'm doing it via a live demo, but what if I had a set of slides here where I wanted to sort of walk you through various chunk options? It is, even when we have our code visible, so let's get rid of any of the code chunk options that hit our code, the options themselves don't get printed. But there is a way of being able to do that with Quarto. So this is a bit of a quick teaching tip. If I was to say that I want the fenced as my code chunk option and render this document, I can see that not only does the code get processed, but I am actually able to see my code chunk options on my output, which is really neat for sort of teaching how these code chunk options work. And very smartly, Quarto will hide the one that says show the code chunk options, and everything else is there. So let's talk a little bit more about what other ways we generally tend to edit documents like this. For example, I have some text here that says the figure below is a bar plot of species of penguins. A good practice here would be to not say the figure below, but instead to add a cross-reference. So let's go ahead and do two things. One, in the label, I am going to add the suffix fig. So, sorry. Did I do? That is not what I meant to do. Okay. I am adding the suffix fig to the label of this code chunk. And then what I am going to do is I am going to insert a cross-reference. Oh, I think this is, let's go ahead and do it this way. So I'm going to copy this label, and I will just say, let's go ahead and insert this cross-reference with just the @ sign and go ahead and render that document. Quarto will automatically number this figure and also add a cross-reference to it. The one thing, though, as soon as you number the figure, it also expects a caption for it as well. So that's another thing that I would want to add, a figure caption, something like scatter plot of fill depth and length of penguins. Depending on your audience or the purpose of why you've included this plot, you might go into more or less detail in your caption, but that basically allows me to now have a proper cross-reference to my figure and a caption associated with it as well. We can do the same thing with tables too. This time, instead of fig, I am going to use the suffix tbl for table. And let's go ahead and add a caption for this as well. The first 10 penguins in the data set. And let's go ahead and render this real quick without actually adding our cross-reference first. So if I don't insert a cross-reference, I still get my caption. I just don't have anything hyperlinked to it. And if I do want to do that, another way I can go ahead and insert it is using what's called the insert anything tool, which you can pop up with the / on your keyboard. So let's go ahead and add, oh, I think it's just not finding the one that's not referenced yet. Okay. That's a bug that I believe is fixed, and I forgot to update my Quarto version before that. So I apologize for this, but that should be fixed in the Quarto version that's released now. All right, so we were able to sort of add our cross-reference to our table as well. And one last thing we're going to do before we move on to a different document format is we've done two pesky things: cross-references to figures and cross-references to tables. And the last pesky thing that I often have to do when I'm writing documents is citations. So what I'm going to do here is right at the spot where I have inserted some information about my data set. Let's go ahead and use the insert anything tool again. Or I can do it using the insert menu from my document. I want to add a citation. You can see that you can link your Zotero library if that's a service you use, as long as you have it sort of like running on your computer. RStudio will automatically find it, and anything in your library you can link to easily from within RStudio, or using a DOI. So let's go here and take a look at the DOI for the paper where the Palmer Penguins data comes from. So I'm going to copy that, go back to RStudio and paste that DOI to search. And we can see that it goes out and does a search for the DOI. And I can choose to insert that as an in-text citation or not. Here I can customize what bib file is going to get created and what is going to be called. I'm going to just call that references.bib, and let's go ahead and insert that. So two things happened. One, a citation has been inserted here, and number two, my YAML gained a new line. And also, if I look at my files pane, I have gained a references.bib file as well that has the sort of bib information that I don't know, if you're like me, you otherwise would have copied and pasted from Google Scholar, for example. And let's go ahead and render this document.
Quick question here, Mina.
Yeah.
Are all these chunk options like standard markdown chunk options, or does Quarto add additional chunk options like the ones that you showed like on tables and figures?
Both. So there are the standard ones of will work, but there are other ones as well. And a really good place to go for those is if you go to the Quarto website and look under reference, depending on your document type. So let's go ahead and pick HTML, for example, and you can see all the possible sort of code or code execution options listed here.
Great. Maybe there's even some sort of cheat sheet.
I'm sure there will be soon.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and look here. I have my reference that I want to that I can hover over and see, and it has also been printed at the bottom of my document as well. Yeah, so if you want your figures to have consistent sizing, for example, you can in fact add that to the YAML of your document and it will propagate through to all of them. That's generally, I would say, good practice. And then generally what I do is I will set that up on top of my document. And then for some of my figures, like if I have a lot of facets or something, I might locally change a couple of them. But otherwise, if it's a single figure, it's always the same figure width. And my strong recommendation is to set the figure width and the aspect ratio and sort of play with that to get to your desired output. All right, so we've talked a lot about documents, but what else do we do generally? You probably also make slides. So let's go ahead and take this exact document and turn it into slides. The only change that I need to do is in the YAML of my document, instead of HTML, I'm going to say that I want to make Reveal.js slides. As soon as I say that, the visual editor tells me just reload things, so I can let it do that. And let's go ahead and render this document. So now my title has become my title slide. Everything else, in my second level headings have become slide headings. And everything else is basically presented in my document. This is not generally what a slide deck might look like. We usually might have sections, so let's go ahead and insert that. So I am going to say that maybe a first level heading called Introduction. And maybe after this, we might have another first level heading called Model Results, or maybe Modeling Results. And then, I don't know, maybe something like Model 1, and maybe you're sort of looking at two competing models, so on and so forth. And I'm going to add that last section, which would be called, last slide, that would be called references. So if I take a look here at my document outline, here we go. I have a nice hierarchical setup to my document. I have two main sections for my talk, an introduction and some modeling results section, and then 3 slides within each one of those. Let's render this document now so that we can see how those different level headings are presented on the output side. So one of the neat features, I think, of Quarto is that you automatically get this little hamburger menu that will give you a document outline, as well as some tools to do things like get a PDF export mode that your audience, if they want to like save things as a PDF or print them out, they can easily get to those. And we can see that the document outline that we created is sort of represented here as well. Something that happened is my code is gone, and even though I didn't hide it, so the Reveal.js output by default will hide your code with the assumption that you have pretty precious real estate in your document, that in your slides, that you might not necessarily want to have code there. But clearly it was designed by someone who doesn't teach code. So let's go ahead and bring that back. So that was in execute and echo true. And let's take a look at the slide over here with our figure. So when I have my code here, what happened to my figure is that it got really squished at the bottom of my slide. That is Reveal.js trying to be helpful to me and say, well, you only have this much space, so I will let the figure take however much space you have. The thing is, this is just a very silly look for a figure. So what we could do is break this up into 2 slides. In our Markdown land, the way you would do this is you would have to write your code chunk and give it a label and then reference that. But with the with Quarto slides, you can use a code chunk option called output location, and we could do it such that the output shows up on the next slide or in the next column, or something like the column fragment, where the first column with your code shows up first, and then the second column with your output shows up second. I'm going to choose slide so that I can see my code take, the full space that I have on the first slide. Let's go ahead and do that. And so I can see that the slide got broken into two, and one of them has my code and the other one has my output. I probably would want to do something like grow this size a little bit so it takes up a little bit more space on my slide. And let's take a look at one other neat functionality code chunk option, particularly if you are teaching code. Oftentimes, it's helpful to be able to highlight certain aspects of your code. For example, you might say lines 3 to 6 show aesthetic mappings. So I'm going to say that I want to highlight code line numbers, and I'm going to give it a character string that first highlights lines 3 to 6 for aesthetic mappings. And let's say that then I want to highlight line number 10 for the colorblind color scale. So let's go ahead and render this. And while that's rendering, there's a question in the chat. If we want to touch the slides to change some small details, is the idea to do that in Quarto, or something where you exported it to? I'm going to say that is up to you, and it depends on how much you might need to reproduce it another time. If basically that is the end goal and it seems easier to sort of resize things there, or maybe add more sort of different types of animations, like in Keynote, you can have a figure appear with flames. I don't think you can do that by default in Quarto. So if you have things like that to add, embellishments to add, you of course could do that, but you do end up losing the reproducibility aspect for those last bits. That being said, professional data visualization folks will create data visualizations, say in R, and then export to Illustrator and do the last bits there. So it's not like this is some odd frowned upon practice. It really depends on where you're going to be using that same document next. So going back to our rendered document, I have my code. If I advance my slides once, I can see that lines 3 to 6 are highlighted, the rest are grayed out. I advance again, I can see that line 10 is highlighted, so I can, talk about those. And then on my next slide is my figure that's a little bit larger now. All right, so we've talked about documents and we've talked about slides. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take this back to being a HTML document. Oh, I edited the wrong YAML field. Here we go. And let's reload this. And note that I have some code chunk options in this document right now that make no sense in a static HTML document. Like, they make sense in the context of slides, like the output location being the next slide, but they don't make sense in the context of this document. The neat thing is I don't end up getting errors about that. They just sort of get ignored. This could be frustrating potentially for debugging purposes maybe, but I think what I really enjoy about this is that if you're writing, something like lesson notes and then going ahead and making slides out of them, you don't have to keep touching your document's content. You can simply play with the YAML to go from one output to the other. Oh, well, I am using a piece of software called Mouse Pose for this, so I can type that in the chat. That does some neat things, including that highlighting. Okay, so I have two documents in my project. I have this index HTML document, and I have my talk slides that I started with at the very beginning. So let's go ahead and make a website where we can bring these two documents together. In order to make a website, I'm going to leverage Quarto's project functionality. So I'm going to create a plain text file, and I'm going to save that file as _Quarto.yml. And I'm going to say that I want to make a project. The type of the project is website. And in this project, I want to say that in this website, I want to have my project title be Hello Quarto. And let's create a navigation bar where on the left side, sorry, I have index.qmd, which is a document we created, and then my talk slides that I started with at the beginning, which was talk.qmd. So I have created this YAML file. And one thing that I'm going to do right now is in RStudio, I am going to go ahead and relaunch this project. So I'm just clicking on relaunching the project. There we go. I think it's just doing its thing under the hood. And as I did that, I gained a new tab in my RStudio window called my build tab. And in here, I have a button called render website. So let's go ahead and render this website. And here we go. We have a website with one document called Hello Penguins and another document called Hello Quarto, where I have my slides. Lots of redundancy here on my navigation bar, so maybe we can fix that. So let's say that this can be called home. And let's say this can be called slides. And let's go ahead and render one more time. Thank you for the note. All right, so let's take a look at what our website looks like now. I have my website, the page that I called home, and my slides over here as well. So we've gone through sort of 40 minutes of this, and we've gone through how to create a single document, a slide deck, and then put them together in a website. So the last thing that we might want to do is to publish this website. Before I do that, let me go ahead and clean things up a little bit. So these files, these folders that have sort of the images from the first time I rendered my document, I'm going to go ahead and delete those. The output of my documents are now in this folder called _site by default. And I am going to, let's go ahead and render things one more time to make sure everything is working properly. And once you have a website, right, you have the source code for a website, you might have your own tools for publishing. So if you use something like GitHub Pages, we could push stuff to GitHub and then turn on GitHub Pages and publish it that way. If you are either new to it and wanting to learn a new approach, or you just want to try a different approach, another possibility is to use Quarto Pub. So I am going to, in my terminal this time, type Quarto Publish and hit enter. And it's going to give me a few options for publishing. So to Quarto Pub, to GitHub Pages, to Posit Connect or Netlify or Confluence. I am going to choose Quarto Pub. I want to publish with this account. And it tells me that a website with the title Hello Quarto is already published there. And it's asking me to give it a new name. So how about I give it, I think this is what I'd called my repo. And basically, we're rendering. And here we go. We actually have our website published, and I will share the sort of the link with you here as well if you would like to take a look. So we've been able to go from single documents to bringing them together in the context of a website to publishing pretty rapidly with the tools we have. As you can imagine, as your project grows, some of this stuff can be a little bit more time consuming, but the steps don't change. It might just be that the computational complexity of your project grows, and hence render times might be slower. But aside from that, the workflow is going to be exactly the same. One other thing I could talk about, if there's interest, is writing journal articles with Quarto. So we could demo that quickly as well, if you like, or I'm happy to also see if there are any questions about the demo. Is there an interest?
Maybe we start with some questions about the demo,
Yeah.
and if there's still time, then it would be great to kind of like include that. First of all, thank you so much for this really great live demo. I mean, I'm wondering, do folks have questions?
Yeah, it looks like there is one. So Posit hosts the website, the Quarto Pub website. It is very similar to R pubs if you have used that before, where if you render an R Markdown document, there would be a little publish button that you could immediately publish with. So the idea is exactly the same. It is open to the world, except someone would need to know your URL. So, they won't just be able to stumble upon it, but the website itself is not private in any way.
Okay, great. One question maybe from my side along the lines of like converting our Markdown to Quarto, coming from years of working in our Markdown, there's of course a great interest in like doing this conversion. One thing that we noticed, I can just take my RMD and like rename it to .qmd and render it with Quarto. Is that just fine, or is there anything one will need to be careful with such conversions?
It's totally fine. You can do exactly that, basically. Or if you have a Quarto project as such, let's say you have a website and you have some RMD documents from before, but you're saying going forward, I want to write QMD documents, you can bring RMDs and QMDs together, or just rename your RMDs to QMDs. The one place this will fail is if you have slide decks created with the Sheringen package. Those Quarto won't be able to render. Because they don't use Reveal.js. But aside from that, any R Markdown document, Quarto should be able to render.
Fantastic. And our Markdown is the basis of like many vignettes in like packages from CRAN, packages from Bioconductor. Is the vision here that Quarto will replace those in the long run? That those are becoming Quarto documents?
I don't think there's a vision to replace necessarily. I think if there's desire from the community to be able to leverage some of the features of Quarto that are not as easily accessible in our Markdown to be included in package vignettes, I can see such a move. But the vision from the development side of Quarto is not to say, we're going to change the entire ecosystem, we're going to change all the vignettes in our packages. The vision is to create an interface where multilingual teams or individuals who work, across multiple languages can operate together easily, and also to sort of make some, to bring together the knowledge gained from like 10 years of maintaining the R Markdown ecosystem together in one one interface.
Great. 2 more questions in the chat.
Let's see. Quarto, yeah. So you can with Quarto, you can add interactivity with Plotly, sure. And also you can do observable, which also has interactivity as well. So you can either stay in the R land and have your code chunks generate sort of interactive plots. You can embed Shiny apps in it as well as HTML widgets of any sort. Or if you're outside of the R ecosystem and you want to be writing code in another language, observable is potentially a good option for interactivity. And I think there's a question about the video. Maybe you would be more
Yeah, we will
in a better
certainly
place
make
to
this
answer.
available. This will become available on our website. And I will post the link where it will become available here in the chat.
There's one more question from Tyrone.
Yes. So I think one of the nicer things about this is going through either knit or pandoc. I'm still rather confused about the marketing between knit, pandoc, distill when rendering out to flat format. So HTML for interactivity, that's great, but the sad reality is the middlemen of publishers is a dire reality for anyone in academia. So how do you get your very complicated text structures from either in expensive equations or expensive or a lot of graphs and put that into PDF when you have 4 different tools to do that? So what is rather supported? Is it all going to Pandoc? Because it seems like the lot of Quadro's cross-platform utility comes from Pandoc being that broad, or is there going to be in the future any improvements to knit? Because that's something that you guys were also working on with Tidyverse. Or are you still supporting this still?
So many questions in there. So maybe I will, I'll share the rest of my slides that I think will answer some of them. And if not, I'm happy to sort of say more. So one of the things is that basically Quarto is sort of doing all of this orchestration. So we have a QMD document and the code chunks are processed either by Knitter or Jupyter. And then you get this sort of markdown document as this interim document that then goes through a Pandoc. And the idea is, to my knowledge, there is no plan to sort of replace this step, right? There's no plan to necessarily replace the Pandoc step with something else. In fact, the Quarto team has been working with folks who work on the development of Pandoc just to sort of stay afoot, learn about what is happening in Pandoc to make sure that Quarto always stays current with it. There is also no sort of goal to like renew Knitter to be something entirely different or Jupyter to be something entirely different. So these will continue to stay as well, but there's always improvements that are being added to Knitter, just like I'm sure there's always improvements that are being added to Jupyter as well. So much of the improvements to Knitter that have happened to support Quarto actually, will work with our markdown as well. Not everything that I have shown, just because, some of the things are about cross-referencing and whatnot, where we're now going out of the code chunk and into the text. But those are, each of these sort of pieces of the puzzle are still staying. What is happening is there's just like sort of better support for them and better integration for them. And in terms of distill, so I'm afraid I'm not the best person to answer that question, but maybe one way I can approach it is that sort of distill was sort of implemented as an R package, and Quarto is not an R package. Right, so it's a command line interface that that you don't need R to run it at all. It's just you might be using alongside R, but is support for distill gone? No, the answer to that is no, that I am sure of. But are there improvements being added to distill? My guess is no. Instead, that energy is going into sort of making Quarto better. But the project isn't abandoned in any way.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for the interruption, but just this slide was such a great segue into one of the questions that I had. So in your talk, we have primarily focused on like R chunks, marked R chunks in your Quarto document. But one really great thing that this slide here shows that Quarto is kind of like a multi-language, a multi-engine product that allows to easily also incorporate like Python chunks very much in the same way as you had shown it for R chunks. And I was just wondering, how do you envision the use cases there, in particular in a collaborative setting? Do you imagine like a Python developer and an R developer working together in one like a Quarto document, each having their own chunks, or what do you think?
So one way that that can be is, for example, we might have another document here that's like my notebook.ipynb, and Quarto can render IPython notebooks as well. So for example, we might be working on a project where I write my slides with R chunks and in a QMD document, and you might be writing Python code, your analysis, and we can bring them both together in the same project. And so Quarto render will basically render this all together. We don't need to do anything separate for that. When we get into documents, a single document that has both of the chunks, that can also work as well. But I think this is probably the most common use, where you have a project where folks contribute in different formats, and someone else could be doing an RMD file here as well. So each of these can sort of live together in the same project, and the same render button or the Quarto render command can render them out. Maybe let me say a bit about sort of where to go next from here before, since there doesn't seem to be other questions right this moment. So I think the best place to sort of get started or deep diver into Quarto is the Quarto website. The Get Started menu has sort of tutorials depending on the tool that you like to use. So if you write code in VS Code or Jupyter versus RStudio, like I demoed here, or really any other text editor, you can go through and sort of get through these 3 tutorials. If you have a good handle on like Quarto, like sort of introduction to Quarto, or if you feel like this introduction was sufficient and now you want to really learn about what are the different things I can create, the guide is a great place to go for that, and sort of diving deeper into, how do I write a book with Quarto, for example. There is a new release of Quarto coming out, Quarto 1.3. So there's been a lot of blog posts around that and some really nice functionality. So let me demo one of these pieces of functionality that I find sort of very handy. So I'm going to do this. Let's go ahead and open this index QMD and say that I want to have an HTML on my slides, obviously, but I also want to have a PDF output of the same document as well. And I want that to be easily accessible. So I can go to my build tab and go ahead and say render website. And you can see that I have my, oh, you can't see what I'm doing on my RStudio window? I'm sorry. How about now?
Yes. No,
okay. Okay. Sorry about that. So what I did is I went to my my document index.qmd, and I edited the YAML to not just say HTML, but to have 2 options, HTML and PDF. So multiple formats from the same document. And you can see that this index, a PDF file was created. Let's take a look over here, and it's basically linked from the side of the document here. So I can actually sort of easily get multiple formats of documents. Now, where are my slides? Okay, I think I need to, sorry, render these slides one more time quickly. All right. So that is one of the pre-release sort of highlights, which is multi-format publishing. So there are a few other exciting updates coming up with that as well. And regularly there's been posts on the Quarto blog, most recently about this new release that's coming out, but also in general, it's a great place to sort of follow up with what's going on. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Well, thank you so much. Are there any further
You're welcome.
questions for Mine? If not, it was a really great live demo. Thank you so much for coming. We really
You're
enjoyed that.
welcome.
Excellent. And I maybe conclude the session by saying after the highlight today, and next week will be another highlight in our CCB seminar. We have Aaron Lunn coming, the mastermind behind the orchestrating single cell analysis with bioconductor, and he will give a little bit an insight from a developer's perspective. And we're very much looking forward to this one. So I hope I see many of you guys also there. So thank you very much, Mina, and
Thanks.
goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.